Hitler. And there is still a small but influential movement called the Atlantic movement, which promotes this sort of idea. And the big thing about it, okay, first of all, emphasise the principle of democracy, which has to be a fundamental principle of any world government, if you like. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. We just have to insist on it. And so this one involves democracy, the principle of democracy, before, if you like, universality, which is the UN. So let me see, I'm not sure what happens here. Well, yes, it does allow the European strategy. It would allow to proceed just by treaty, by treaty, by treaty. No charters in the way. You can evolve over time. Yeah, so there are no great barriers in the way. And as I say, Europe is the example of that. Democracy is a fundamental principle. So the first step along that path, sort of following the European example, would be a world community process. Whoops, all right. Right. Again, I modified this, but here is where I'm going to lose half my audience. One possibility, an example, would be based on NATO. And people say, well, NATO is a military organisation, we want nothing to do with that. But it's better to regard it as a security organisation. Peace and security go together, especially in this current state of the world. So, never mind that, NATO is the core. If we made various changes by means of a new treaty regarding NATO, this is a possible scenario. On this one, the first thing would be to give it a global role, and that's what it's been doing. In other words, make its role to be the security arm and the peacekeeping arm of all its members. And in fact, it's sort of done it. It's taken on a global role, leading the operations in Afghanistan, in Libya, and Kosovo. But secondly, open it to democracies around the globe. If it's got a global function, if you like, then why not open it to other democracies around the globe, such as Australia, such as Japan, such as very possibly India. And then it does become, it's not universal, but it does become a global organisation. And I mean, the hope is that over time it will evolve, new members will join as they become democratic, and it will eventually become universal, if you like, at the same time as the world becomes universally democratic. Again, it's going to take a long time, but we've got to take the long view. Secondly, introduce, well, a weighted voting system, as the Europeans have done. So NATO at the moment operates by consensus, which means every member has a veto, and that makes operations and agreements very, very hard to achieve. There'll be lots of complaints about that and suggestions along these lines. Thirdly, vitally important, they should pledge only to undertake operations outside the membership, if authorised to do so by the Security Council. Now that's just international law, but that would be particularly an obligation under international law, but they should acknowledge that explicitly. And that actually would have a huge effect. That would mean it becomes almost an arm of the United Nations. It only operates externally if the Security Council says so, and in a sense, everybody's obliged to do that if the Security Council does authorize an action. So, in a sense, NATO would then become, if you like, the strong right arm of the United Nations, and they would fit together as complementary parts of a global organisation. So it would then sort of fill the role as initially thought of in the Charter. The Charter, I think, provides for something, a military staff or a military organisation of 20 divisions, I forget what it was. a strong component, which never happened, but NATO could fill that role. Fourthly, following Europe again, it should channel funds towards development of the less advanced members. The idea, this is under the so-called principle of solidarity, that you know, if you're members of the community, then everybody should have equal rights, equal opportunities. You bring the less advanced members up to speed. So a sort of Marshall Plan for the less advanced members, which is very much what Europe has done again, and it gives a big incentive for new members to join. So that would be a major consideration. Finally, following the Europeans, you want embryonic forms of government in there. So we should add a court to NATO to provide an embryo of a legal system to adjudicate disputes between members. Members are obliged to, you know, if a dispute is liable to lead to conflict, they should take it to this court. And then we need a prototype of a parliament, and that already exists. So there is a parliamentary North Atlantic Assembly already associated with NATO. So that's a scheme, a possibility. Who knows where it will come into being. There have been quite a number of proposals, somewhat along these lines, and Lewis mentioned one, namely John McCain, who was a presidential candidate at the last election, advocated not a community but a
coalition
alliance, anyway, something along those lines. And that's maybe another point, that a thing like this could be agreed by not only the left but progressives, but even the right of politics in the US, so it actually has a chance of gaining acceptance. Anyway, I've said enough. That's one possibility. I think I'll hand over to Daryl. Where's the one there?
Chris, you've got that other slide.
The other one. Sorry, I just turned it off.
These around. We've got one coming around, that's about the UN Parliamentary Assembly, it's about the World Citizens Association. Just gives you a bit about what the organisation's on about. Thanks. I'll just take it on something. So I guess as I said before, the World Citizens Association is trying to promote discussion, research and so on about this. Dr. Tam up the back there, he's also part of the World Citizens Association on the executive. And we also have an institute set up, ready to work with the university to get research happening and so on. So we're pursuing funding, so we're looking at that research side of things as well. But I guess the other side that I'm particularly passionate about is the educational side. Because really what we're talking about here is not on anyone's radar. No one's really discussing it, thinking about it. And we're talking about something that's fairly big. And we talk about solving global problems and dealing with global problems And I don't have the answer, and we don't have the answers, but as an educationist, I figure we need to educate everyone about all this, because there's people out there, new citizens coming through, young people who maybe do have some answers, who can find the way through. So that's why I spend a lot of my time telling students about this at university, schools, and teachers, and so on, to get a lot of people thinking about this. I'll just say a few more things, and then we'll open it to questions. My problem as a teacher is the problem of engagement. How do you engage students in a topic like this? Now, I can engage students in the nuclear topic. I don't have a problem with that. I think engaging people with the nuclear issue is easy. As soon as you explain what a nuclear weapon does, and that they have over 1,000 on hair trigger alert that could be fired in the next 20 minutes and destroy the world, that gets you engagement. And people can start saying, well, what would that mean for everything? Even if one went off somewhere, that's an engaging thing. You get people in and think, no, okay, why is that? How can we do something about it? And so on. But this is not so easy to engage students. As a teacher, how do I teach students? What sort of unit of work would I teach students to get their heads around this? And I still really don't have the answer. Maybe some of you might have the answer. I can engage students in teaching about Germany, I'll teach about the Nazis, Hitler, and all that sort of stuff. That's not a problem. Or teach about a whole lot of topics of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Or this topic, I find it very difficult personally. But I'm looking for ways. One possible way is Einstein. Very simply, because Einstein was one of the biggest proponents of a world government. He led the scientists after the atomic bomb, their development, because he wanted the Americans, he thought the Germans were going to get it, so that's why he suggested to Roosevelt that they better try and develop an atomic bomb first. And that then many of the scientists that worked on the project after the war with Germany ended were very dismayed that it was to be used on Japan. And they totally objected to that. And then once it was used, that led to a big backlash among scientists, and particularly Einstein himself. He took a lot of time out of all of his science work. He just dropped it for a period of time and promoted this idea of world government. His saying was, and this is a book that came out that he contributed to, was one world or none. That either we have one world, we get one government, we have one world, we cooperate on all these things, or we have none, now that nuclear weapons exist. That without a proper, strong world government, you won't be able to control nuclear weapons, and they'll mean the end of the world as we know it. One world or none. That's one point of engagement, because most people have heard about Einstein, and many students, are interested in him, want to know more about him. So maybe that's one way of getting into it, because Einstein has a long political history. He's been involved in politics for much of his life. It goes back to World War I. He was in the peace movement in Germany. He was advocating a negotiated end to World War I, along with many other progressives in Germany during that war. His pedigree goes right back then, and so he's always been a political thinker. The other thing about Einstein is he tends to be right. He makes predictions and they tend to turn out. So I'm sort of hoping this prediction won't turn out. He's saying, do I have one world or none? Because it means really we've got to get one world, because otherwise it might come true, what he's saying. So I think maybe that's a point of engagement. Maybe you might have ideas. I'm just thinking of how do I educate students who know nothing about it, and go from there to know enough about it to take that further. That's one path. As a history teacher and a reader of history books and writer and all that sort of stuff, I can get engaged with the topic. I was lucky. I was at Lewis's World Government Research Network workshop a couple of weeks ago with Chris and Tam and about 20 other people from around the world, including Andreas Bummel, who's there from Germany, the guy who's got the Dao Phat campaign. And I was very fortunate to be there, but I was fortunate to sit next to Joseph Baratta. And Joseph Baratta is probably in his 70s or so. He's an academic, he's a scholar, and I found out that he is the authority on the history of world federalism since World War II. He's written 2 very quality volumes. His name is Joseph Baratta. What did I say? Joseph Preston Baratta. You've got to put the second name in because there's another Joseph Baratta who's totally different to him. He's a politician or something. Joseph Preston Baratta. And his books are very expensive, unfortunately, and going for a lot of money because they probably didn't print enough. But I managed to get a couple. Now I can get engaged with that, and one of my aims is to get my head around that history and to see, well, how can we make that history and how can we kind of maybe encapsulate that in some sort of more understandable version for the students. So that's one of the ways. But that's my main concern, and as far as the WCAA is concerned, our aim is to try and get new young members in. And we're starting with university. We have the Model Global Parliament that Para Wells here has started off. It's been going for a number of years, and that's happening in September this year, September the 12th. At the Parliament House in New South Wales, and they also happen in the other couple of cities. So that's happening, and those we found people come along and they really want to be part of that. They're really excited about it and want to be it's sort of like model UN, except we're looking at this idea of this being a model parliament, projecting into the future and thinking, well, how would a model parliament, or how would a real world parliament deal with these problems? So that's one way, and well, that's probably our main way at the moment, looking at other ways of trying to engage people with this issue. But I might leave it there to just take questions, and then we'll go from there and see. Maybe we've got some ideas, as well as maybe have some questions. Okay?
Yes, thank you, Dao and Chris. I'd like to draw your attention to the 4th Global Week of Action for a World Parliament, which is going to be held from the 20th to the 30th of October in 2016. There's a fabulous website up, and I think this is Andreas's World Parliament now. And they have let the people decide, and they have lots of suggestions for activities, actions, how to participate, blog, gallery, videos, resources, feedback. And they're encouraging people all over the world to link into this and to demonstrate that there's a global movement behind the idea of the World Parliament.
Yeah.
So I commend this to you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's really good. I don't think it was Andreas started it, but he's part of it.
Oh, he's certainly part of it, yes. It comes out actually on the UNPA website.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. It's just a little late for us, with inconvenient time.
Yep.
To put on our MGP anyway.
Yes, but if the UNAs around Australia could perhaps do it and connect with it.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm hoping. He's also a member of the UNAA to try and get the UNAA to engage with this issue and also the nuclear issue.
Yes.
Because one of the major proposals is to do it through the UN structures, and those little blue charters that you've got in your show bags, the UN Charter and the EDA Charter. And the UN Charter, you look at Article 22. It's a very short article, but that article enables the creation of other bodies by the UN General Assembly. So that would be the avenue that they would pursue. One of the exciting things that Andreas did with University of Germany recently was to run a whole simulation for a couple of days or something with a whole lot of uni students who were debating the idea of creating a UN Parliamentary Assembly and how they would go about it, how they would structure it, and they ran it over a couple of days to look at something. Well, if we were going to go down that track, let's simulate how we do it, and how we put those arguments, how we make the decisions about weighted voting, about all those sorts of things. So getting students involved in these very practical things is one way of getting the knowledge out there. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just wondering about the European Union situation there. We've got poorer nations like Greece and Italy who don't sort of step up to the mark and they sort of drain on the finances of the whole union. And then you've got the Islamists of the union and they've come in and a different set of values. You've got all these sort of conflicting things happening. I appreciate you, it's a very optimistic approach, but I suppose the evolutionary process of bringing all these things to pass. But you could comment a bit more on the
phase
of the European Union, because that's sort of a test case, as I said.
I'd say a couple of things in terms of values. The European Union does have common values, and one of the ones Chris talked about, prevention of war. They've prevented war between, particularly, France and Germany. War is out of the question for solving any problems. It's not going to war within countries of Europe. It's not going to solve anything. They realise that. And the benefit of that is incredible, and the security that comes from that is really important. The other value that we forget about in the European Union is the Holocaust. The Holocaust is one thing that to be a member of the European Union, you have to believe that that it happened and that you're opposed to it, that you take a moral stance on the Holocaust, that genocide is not on. It is absolutely unacceptable, should never ever happen. That's one reason that not the only reason, it's one reason that Turkey, that has wanted membership of the European Union for quite a few years, is not allowed in, because Turkey had its own genocide of the Armenians in 1915, 1.5 million Armenian people, and they deny that it happened, and it's illegal to talk about it and be arrested for talking about it in Turkey. So there is that. There are some common European values. My hunch and guess, I mean, we're talking about the European Union, the problems, yes, and the economic and so on, and Britain moving out. My guess is, with all these things that are happening, the insecurities around the world, my guess is the European Union might actually strengthen, because they have threats. They've got the authoritarian threat from Russia. They've got declining world situation, but instability in the Middle East. Now they're looking at having an authoritarian dictatorship in Turkey after all this so-called countering the coup. I mean, the resident holiday teachers for me got me on that side straight away. What's the point? And all the judges getting rid of the entire judicial system, really. I mean, they're heading down. To me, it looks like Germany in 1933. That's what Hitler did. Hitler used the Reichstag fire. Said they didn't know who started, which then he used that to progressively take away all the building blocks of democracy. The only difference in Turkey is they're not doing it progressively, they're doing it all at once. So we're going to see I think, a dictatorship in Turkey. This is just my opinion. And also the threat of terrorism within the European Union is another security concern. So I can see the security concerns outweighing the economic concerns of the European Union. I can see the European Union thinking we need tighter security within the European Union, and also we need tighter security outside in terms of the threats posed by Russia and by Turkey perhaps, and the instability in the Middle East, that maybe it's going to go that direction. I don't know, but maybe Chris probably has thought about it a lot longer than me. So.
No, I haven't. But yes, my comment would be yes. I think we're going backward, both in Europe and globally at the moment. Things seem to be getting worse. What we heard from the Global Peace Index, right? But hopefully that's just part of the normal fluctuations of the political situation. But I think it's true. Even a great organisation like the EU can make mistakes. So looking back, it might be a mistake to have a common European currency too early without a common financial system. They've gone to this two-speed Europe, so there were Euro nations and then the rest, and now Britain is sort of full off the back. Maybe that was a mistake. Personally, well, this is really getting controversial, but Germany inviting 1 million migrants in all in one lump, I think that's too much, it's causing trouble. But hopefully they'll recover and resume their onward trajectories.
Part of I think the other problem is that the lack of empowerment, political empowerment that people have in the European Union. They have their governments, and then above that there's the European Union, but there's European elections, and I'm not exactly sure how all those work, but the bureaucracy, the European Union is run by a bureaucracy, really. And I don't think people feel that they have that connection with the European Parliament, perhaps, and that's why there's this, want to pull away from it. And this is what we need to look at when we look at any sort of global parliament. You need to look at creating a sense of shared values and global citizenship so that people can feel a connection with this highest body in the world. One of the interesting things in the last session, the Secretary General, it's interesting, but the UK UNAA is running a campaign called 1 for 7 billion. And that is to promote this idea that this Secretary General that's going to be elected, that in the end, what we want may not happen with this one, but what we should have is that Secretary General should be selected by the world, not by 5 members of the permanent, 5 members of the Security Council. That's where we need to go. That 7 billion people in some way should have a say in who that person is going to be. Now, okay, that's not going to happen soon, but this idea of having this democratic say. George Monbiot that Lewis talked about, he said that today everything is being globalised except our consent. So there's no, democracy's not being globalised. Everything else is being globalised. Lots of decisions being made for us by other elites, transnationals, governments, non-state actors, businesses. They're all making decisions for us. We have no say in those decisions. So it's all being globalised, there's no consent. So I think we need to bring that into it. Just on the other thing, there's a guy, James Thompson, who spoke at this workshop that Lewis had in Brisbane. He's been studying the US, and he is basically, his thesis is that the United States, Canada, and Mexico, yes, Mexico, are eventually looking towards, will eventually integrate. And he's saying, despite, Trump saying he's going to build a wall, he's saying this has been a gradual thing, and it's been happening for many years, and it goes back to the Cold War, and the thing that fuels it is security concerns. And the security concerns during the end of the Cold War were the Soviet Union, but now the security concerns are the Russians moving into the Arctic, now that the ices are melting and they're all going in there to dig up, fine oil and all sorts. The Russians have been very active up the north, and there's this movement towards economic integration and further integration. That despite what people are actually in government, that it's probably going to head in that direction due to other greater threats from outside. The Canadian and the American armed forces under NORAD are pretty well synced, pretty well acting as one military force now. So despite all the rhetoric about Mexico and about that, we're probably looking down the track as strengthening the regions due to security concerns. That could happen in North America, and I suggest it may well happen with the European Union. Who knows?
Can I just add one thing that disappointed me in the Brexit debate? They didn't go back to the beginning. If you go back to the Schuman Declaration, you see that the main objective, the first objective, was peace in Europe. Stop the long series of wars between France and Germany. And that's a huge objective and worth a few arguments about bananas. It should have been emphasised more in the campaign.
Some more questions, Frank?
The question I have in my mind, I'm trying to actually, is around this whole thing about global citizenship, our sense of identification that transcends, if you like, nation states. And I think both of you have kind of stated that, given some examples. And I agree with you, and this is where the question I'm coming to is really about how do we enhance a sense of belonging, of being this sort of global civic culture, given some of these very negative trends that we've got at the moment. And how do we actually enable, especially younger people, to have a sense of hope and a sense of belonging in relation to this thing called democracy. If I can just speak just for a moment around Brexit, we do know that in terms of the opinion polls around Brexit, that maybe 75% of young people in Britain who were of voting age wanted to stay in the European Union. However, a lot didn't go and vote, right? So I mean, there was a kind of consequence around that. And yet, you know, the bump-on effects of that are, in terms of the kind of almost a cynicism sometimes around democracy itself, because you've actually got, unlike the UN, where I know you talked earlier, Chris, about 2/3 and various. In the case of Brexit, it was the majority of people in a system where you have non-compulsory voting, so that you actually get less than 50% of the electorate that actually votes for severing the shift away from the European Union, which I agree with you both as an exemplar of a shift towards a kind of a more internationalist approach. And the gap there, I think, is around awareness. And the awareness, I think, came through that immediately after the Brexit poll, there was an enormous surge of interest to find out what is it, the EU. And I think we're also facing, people that voted the next day, we're out of Europe. I think we've got the similar sort of problem with the UN. A lot of people really don't know about all the good work that goes on. I think it's a real challenge around sort of notions of global citizenship, notions of democracy, participation, and how do we energise some of those things.
Yeah,
I think
well,
it's a real
absolutely.
critical
I
thing.
mean, so that's what Daryl's all on about, getting more of this to schools. We need more discussion in schools. Can I just add one thing? I don't know if you saw the other week, there was a report of this BBC poll on global citizenship, which was extraordinary. It said a majority of people around the globe, I couldn't believe it, think of themselves as global citizens before national citizens, and 70% in China, apparently. I don't know what the question was really. I can't, I'm stunned by that poll, but anyway, that's a very, very hopeful sign.
Yes, sorry, what's your name?
Gwen.
Okay.
So you said it's most likely that this federalist global system revolves like the EU, but I mean, the EU is already with the whole economic coal and steel community, and most people, I think, attribute like the unlikelihood of war between France and Germany to like economic interdependence. So, and the lack of borders vis-a-vis the taxes reduction, like labor immigration. So I guess is that what you imagine for this global federalist system, like a lack of borders, or could you see it evolving from like the TPP type economic agreement, like what kind of political integration?
First go there. Yeah, that opens up a whole spectrum of issues, I suppose. But yeah, first of all, again, have you read the Schuman Declaration? You should go back and check that. So yes, it started out as a coal and steel community, but the aim, right from the beginning, was to stop war, and they announced actually the aim was a European federation, which was still in control. So the whole political aim was there right from the beginning. The second point, yes, it was an economic community to begin with, and that's the ideal situation, I suppose, because if there's economic advantage, which there was, then there would be a powerful motivation for going further. So that would be the ideal. Personally, I just don't see the need or the opportunity for that right now. We've had, again, 70 years of free trade agreements. Free trade is sort of virtually exhausted. If anything, we're going backwards, e.g. Donald Trump. So I don't see the need or the opportunity in that direction. So my scheme was a sort of security scheme rather than an economic scheme, which isn't nearly as good, but on the other hand, there's maybe more of an opportunity there.
So you don't think like TPP could actually?
Well, it all helps, you know, it all goes in the right direction, I think.
The how of how we get there, that's the big question. You know, I guess we look at what opportunities are presented at the time to look at how we best get there. I guess the vision, the first thing for knowing how we're going to get there is to know what we want to get to. So I think the democratic world federalists, and these people go back to pre-World War II and after World War II, I guess what their vision is, and this actually goes back to the peace groups in the late 1800s, their vision was the United States, was the federations that were successful at that time. And the most successful federation in the world at that time was the United States. There you had states come together, give up a part of their sovereignty to create a new level of government, a federal government. And the states continue to exist and continue to do everything that they do, but there's now a new authority created. I know Australia did the same thing in 1901. 6 states joined together and formed a new level, and the federal government, which took certain powers and so on. Now this is what the Democratic World Federalists from the 1940s and even going back to the 1800s, that's their vision, was not we get rid of borders that exist, the borders stay, the nation states stay because they've developed over historically, so we're not going to get rid of those and start again. We use the existing borders, so it's just simply the states, the countries of the world giving up enough sovereignty, and it doesn't have to be a lot, to create a world body which would start out being the beginning would be a UN Parliamentary Assembly, and to gradually from that evolve into other elements of a world system to get virtually, in the end, after a period of evolution, have basically a world federal system. All the nation states that still exist, they'll all be looking after all the things that they normally look after, but with this world structure, we would have a world law, not international law. So world law is law that's enforceable. There are elements of world law at the moment. Anything, resolution passed by the UNSC is enforceable. It's obligatory on all nation states, whereas Kel said before, the General Assembly resolutions are. There are certain aspects of world law creeping into the world at the moment. We're looking at world law having supremacy over international law. So world law is binding, and that would make your international court a binding court. The ICJ, International Court of Justice, the ICC is also, there's elements of world law in there, where that court is